Good evening, everyone. I'm Nana Sajaya, producer and assignment editor at Newsmax in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be here tonight to moderate discussion on America First policy. Here in Kyiv, U.S. foreign policy is not a debate. It is a reality with immediate consequences. What is debated in Washington as a strategy is experienced in Kyiv as security. And in Kyiv, the future of transatlantic alliance is not discussed in theory. It is tested in practice. So what is America First policy? What are its implications? And how do our allies interpret it? These are the questions I will try to get answered from our distinguished speakers tonight. The time is limited, and we have a lot to dive in. So let me introduce you to former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Laura Cooper, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Senior Director of Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador John Herbst, Deputy Defense Minister of Lithuania, Tomas Godliauskas, former Chairman of the Ohio Republican Party and Co-Chairman of Republican National Committee, Robert Paduchik, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and currently affiliated with the Freeman Spogli Institute at the Stanford University, Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, George Kennan, Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Ambassador Steven Sestanovich, and last but definitely not least, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Ambassador Bill Taylor. Thank you, everyone. So we got applause for participation, I guess. Now we can do anything. We are lucky to have Robert Paduchik here, so I will kick off this conversation with a Republican point of view. After all, explain, what is America First?
Thank you. America First is something that I think many people have their own ideas on. A lot of people look at it as something that's just a construct of President Trump and his campaigns, when really it was President Trump campaigning and speaking to something bigger that was out there among the American public. Remember, he's been elected president twice, and the last time he was elected, he received 77 million votes, the popular vote in our electoral college process, which is something that's very unique. It's something a Republican hasn't done for over 20 years. And so I think that when you think about America First, you need to understand it's part of the American ethos. It's out there. It's an important part of where American citizens are, or at least the majority of American citizens. So let me try to frame it in a way maybe that some of you can understand and maybe some of you don't agree with. I think that America First is the same as Ukraina ponad usa. And that means Ukraine above all. And there's nothing wrong with taking pride in your nation and in pride in your heritage and keeping those values and keeping those things dear. And so as we go through this, the challenges of trying to keep a coalition together and fight against Russian aggression, it's important that we try to do things that are constructive for the Ukrainian people, and to set aside the politics and things that should not have a place in fighting this illegal aggression. And so I would also offer that maybe it's not helpful for us to, attack American elected officials, and it's probably not also helpful to come up and talk about America's responsibility under the Budapest Memorandum and not acknowledge the fact that your own country has a responsibility under the Budapest Memorandum. The bottom line is here, we're all here to talk about what we can do to keep the Ukrainian people free and to make them safe, and we should look at ways to do that and set the politics, whether they be domestic or international, aside.
Thank you. I want to ask the same question to somebody who has represented United States, its interests and policies in this country and elsewhere. Ambassador Pfeiffer, what is America First and what is at risk here?
Well, I think Bob has done a very good job of describing the American First approach. And I think a big factor in that, why America First has gained maybe greater traction is the perception, which I think has a basis in reality, that over the last decades, the United States has borne a greater share of responsibility for security in the transatlantic region, and that Europe has not done its share. I think there was a big change, though, made last summer, where President Trump succeeded in persuading NATO leaders to adopt a target of 3.5% of gross domestic product for defense, replacing the previous target of 2%. But I worry that America First may be moving beyond that. In the case of Ukraine, it looks like America First means perhaps taking a huge step back from Ukraine and not continuing the kind of support that we saw up until January of 2025. I worry about some of the comments that the President has made, which suggest that he is considering American withdrawal from NATO. That, to my mind, would be a profoundly huge mistake. A United States that withdraws from NATO is going to produce a Europe that is less stable and less secure, and that is not in the American interest. Moreover, a United States that largely leaves the job of deterring Russia to Europe is likely not to find the Europeans being particularly helpful when the United States seeks their assistance in dealing with the challenges posed by a rising China. So I think that there are real risks if America First moves towards the direction of America alone, which I think would undermine American security, American power, and American influence. So I very much hope that President Trump will look back to his victory of last summer, embrace that win, which has then a NATO with a stronger European contribution, much more prepared, first of all, to deter Russian aggression, but I think also much better prepared to assist Ukraine, which right now is providing the first line of that defense against Russia.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we are delighted to have here a European voice, NATO member country, Deputy Defense Minister of Lithuania. How do you view this, America First? Can it be credibly pursued without interpreting it as America alone, from where you stand, where you sit?
Thank you very much. I think that as we see, first of all, that the transatlantic bond is critical for our national security and defense. As we're reading the America First, we see that there is a kind of a priorities who is set by the U.S. administration, and those are more or less are focused on the geopolitical context. We see how much in the last 3 years there is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is approaching to each other and supporting, and especially we see here in Ukraine how those axes are connecting, and this is a huge concern. I think that, of course, this is the interest on this to be, the still America First is not meaning the alone. I think that it means that it's also talking about the shared commitment. It's talking about the burden sharing, which we are very much supporting, and we much agreed on the Hague, on the 5%. We as a Lithuania actually leading the European commitment of NATO countries. This year, record number budget, 5.38% of GDP directly to just to the defense matters, not for the dual use. And of course, when we see America First is the bigger role. So nevertheless, it is probably hard to imagine to having America alone, because America needs Europe, and needs Europe because if you wanted to projectile the power, if you wanted to have a nuclear deterrence and umbrella, if you want to have a military presence, you have to have European here. So I would say that we don't criticize, we lead by example, and since 2014, Lithuania increased national budget by 10 times, as I mentioned, more than 5% for the next 3 to 5 years to strengthen our defenses. And this is, of course, about also the priorities, which is right now is important.
Is it safe to say you are not worried that America First might turn into America alone?
I don't believe that it will turn to the America alone. Anyway, there is so many things which is probably one what we see not on the media, but what is actually on reality, on plans, on NATO, U.S. contribution to the defense plans, U.S. contributions to the nuclear deterrence, U.S. contributions to the operations, the presence in the States and Lithuania. We have 2 U.S. battalions present. So I think that there is many things on the practical level, on operational level, which are not seems as it seems like from the very first look.
So actions over true social posts, you say. Ambassador Herbst, is America first a rejection of values-based foreign policy, or is it simply a more explicit hierarchy of interests?
I think there is a small strain in the America First movement, which is based overwhelmingly on, you might say, national interest, but only a small strain. You've seen a values dimension in America First, which I think makes sense, but which flies in the face of, I would say, liberal elites both in the United States and in Europe. And you saw that in criticism from J.D. Vance at Munich over a year ago. And I understand why there was unhappiness about some of the things he said. I also think it's unquestionable that censorship was practiced both in the United States and in Europe, relating to religious issues, relating to COVID, relating to global warming, relating to the New York Post story on the Hunter Biden laptop, which flies in the face of democratic and liberal, small L liberal practices. So there's a values component. And I believe that America has both strong national interests and strong value interests in maintaining the international liberal order that we and our allies and our partners created at the end of World War II. That interest is not completely understood amongst some members, very influential members of America First, because they saw us overextend in a not very intelligent way in the greater Middle East. And they analogized that to the very sensible commitment we made to Europe via NATO at the end of World War II. And the odd thing there is that people who call themselves realists simply said our intervention, our support for Ukraine after Russia's invasion of 2014 and then the big invasion of 2022 was like our engagement with American forces in the greater Middle East, when we haven't lost one American soldier or airman or sailor in Europe helping Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine's ability to conduct a war competently vastly exceeded the ability of our partners in the greater Middle East over the past 20 years. Now, anyone who thinks that's realism is not very smart. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go with next question to Ambassador Sestanovich. It's okay. We speak about values. Can the rules-based international order survive if its chief architect becomes more transactional?
Can I say a word about what America alone means?
Sure.
That is not Donald Trump's slogan. That is a criticism of Donald Trump that is very effective in the United States. It accuses the president of squandering America's leadership role, of losing allies, of weakening the United States. So it's important when you try to understand what America First means to understand its origins politically. The president ran on a program of combating immigration and being tougher on trade. He did not really run against American allies. To the contrary, his party remains strongly committed to NATO. Public opinion shows that Americans support a broad global alliance system, and the president has his personal obsessions, but they're not widely shared. And I think it's important not to treat his obsessions as strongly based politically. Now, you said, can the rules-based system exist?
Survive.
If its leading
if the chief architect retreats.
Chief architect abandons it. Well, maybe not, but it certainly will be weakened. The question for the United States is whether it wants to rally to the slogan of the rules-based international order, which is not a very popular slogan. It sounds like a second-grade teacher trying to get the students to obey when they're eager to, do what they want. But if you talk about the strength and effectiveness of a Western bloc, that's popular in the United States. You don't run in the United States for office by saying, I am the champion of international law. You say, I am the champion of American interests. And when you go to international conferences, you occasionally use the term rules-based international order, you hope that the reporters will not actually pick up that term and use it in their stories back home. Because there is still a strong popular base for American leadership, but it has to be described in the right way. Donald Trump found a way to challenge some of those things, but he didn't do it directly, and he didn't say, I'm trying to weaken the United States.
You mentioned Republican Party, and you said President's Party, and I want to follow up with a quick question. His party is not a homogeneous party. Is everyone in Republican Party on the same page?
Well, since you are based in Washington as a journalist, you know that that's not the case. You know that members of Congress have been turning against the president. Some of the people who were some of his strongest supporters have been denouncing him because they say, what is he trying to do? There's a great fragmentation on foreign policy views within the Republican Party, much more so than in the Democratic Party. And they're worried about the way in which this outlook is going to translate into electoral results. They're worried that this is leading to a defeat in November. So people, is the Republican Party homogeneous? No, except in one way. They want to win elections. They're becoming nervous that what the president stands for is undermining their chances in the elections.
Me and you could sit here for another hour and have this one-on-one interview. I see it could have been fascinating, but I'm sorry, we have to cut it over there. Laura, question to you. Very often in America, Ukraine is described as a burden-sharing issue. What does a fair distribution actually look like in a wartime?
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with a little bit of lexicon correction because that's one of my triggering terms, burden sharing. And I think, a lot of folks have talked about how under this administration we've moved actually from burden sharing to burden shifting, which is an even more extreme term. But I really want us to stop using this term. I think that the appropriate terminology relates to investment. This is about investment in our security, in U.S. national security, in European countries' security. So it's shared investment. It's not, I'm not even going to say the word. So I think that's very important to start off with. When you look at Americans, on this question, you first have to ask, well, do they want to even provide assistance to Ukraine? How do they feel about U.S. security assistance to Ukraine? And the polls are actually quite clear on this, including in the past year. The majority of Americans want to support Ukraine by providing U.S. weapons and equipment. So this is very clear. It's a majority. Then you get to the equitable piece. Well, what does that mean? And there's less polling on this, but when you peel back the surface, the answer you tend to get is, well, we want Europe to do as much or more than the United States. Okay, so I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is we're already there. If you look at before this administration stopped U.S. security assistance, new security assistance to Ukraine, at the end of 2024, you basically had roughly equal investments in Ukraine security assistance from the U.S. and Europe, upwards of $60 billion for each. And if you look at economic assistance, there Europe actually beat the United States and had more investment. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, there the U.S. was like 13 or 14 in the number of countries in rank in terms of investment in Ukraine. So we had at least a dozen European countries that were investing more as a percentage of GDP. So this is great. What's the bad news? Okay, the bad news is that most Americans don't know this. Most Americans don't have much visibility on what Europe is actually doing to support Ukraine. In U.S. media, it tends to talk about, bad things that Russia did, good things that the Ukrainian armed forces are doing and that the Ukrainian people are doing, and things that the United States is doing. So there's not a lot of visibility there. And when you add the NATO investment issue to the mix, we were just talking about this, the additional 5% pledge now. This even confuses matters further because, we know that NATO countries have made great strides in their investments just in the past couple of years. But now the goalpost has moved, and it's very hard to communicate easily the complexity of these pledges and how they don't just happen overnight. So I believe that there's an expectation in America that, 5% means next summit rolls around, everybody's at 5%. And we all know that it's more complex than that.
And very, very oftentimes we hear about, you don't like the burden sharing term, I get it, noted. But we hear that Europe must step up. It's happening in Europe, so why are we paying this much time? Ambassador Taylor, are we overestimating Europe's political willingness to act without the United States?
No, Nana, we're not. I mean, we've heard for the last 2 days what the Europeans are doing. And why are they doing that? Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And what's the second reason they're doing it? Because, as Laura just said, Donald Trump has reduced the assistance to Ukraine. Those two things have prompted the Europeans to step up. Europeans understand much better than the Americans the threat from Russia. That said, most Americans understand the threat from Russia, not as well as the Europeans because they're closer, but most Americans understand that Russia is a big threat. Not all of this administration understands that the Russians are the threat, and there's some confusion on that. But the Europeans have stepped up. And we've talked about it over the $106 billion to be supplemented by, well, I don't know, another $117 billion coming out of the European budget over the next. Ukraine is in good shape financially now until 2029. We've talked about the coalition of the willing, not just in the Gulf, but coalition of the willing that the Brits and the French, two nuclear powers, are considering putting in Ukraine on the ground. Armed forces on the ground in Ukraine. That's stepping up. The Europeans are actually doing things. So Admiral Barr made a very good point, and that is, he said that the Europeans and the Ukrainians need to do two things at the same time. They need to boost their possibilities, boost their capabilities, put more resources into their own defense, their own capabilities, defense industrial base, which they are doing. But at the same time, they need to work with the Americans. The Americans have indicated that they may not be there all the time or for a long time, but they're there now, and they need to be. We need to be there, and we need to work with the Europeans. So there's this notion of a European pillar in NATO that can be the guidance.
Thank you, Ambassador Pfeiffer. What is the minimum level of U.S. commitment required to avoid emboldening Russia?
Actually, let me just make a comment on this, then I'll get that question. First, Laura's right.
I'm sorry I failed you. Every question was criticized, but that's the world.
No.
I'll try better next time.
No, Laura's correct. I mean, polls consistently show that more than 60% of Americans want to see the United States providing military support to Ukraine. And I suspect that if there was a free vote taken in Congress, both the House and the Senate, there would be easy support for more military support for Ukraine, including with a lot of Republicans. However, one person disagrees. That's Donald Trump. And thus far, the Republicans in the Congress have not been prepared to challenge him. And thus far, since January of 2025, there has been no new U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. American assistance that's come to Ukraine on the military side has either been funded prior to January of 2025 or is being purchased by European countries to then transfer to Ukraine. So that's my comment on that. On your question, first of all, I think we can all agree an emboldened Vladimir Putin is a bad thing. Second, if we want to prevent Mr. Putin from being emboldened, the best thing that the West can do is provide support to Ukraine so that Putin is stopped and defeated here in this country. That is the way to keep Putin's further ambitions in check. Beyond that, though I do worry about the question of minimum commitment and what that means. I do think that there is a very visible American presence still in Europe, about 100,000 American soldiers, sailors, and airmen. There are American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, so you have that. But you also have, though, a president who, again, regularly talks about leaving NATO. And I worry about that because NATO's deterrence of Russia is based on creating in the minds of the Russians a belief that the risks and costs of attacking a NATO member far exceed any possible gains the Russians might hope to achieve. And with U.S. military power committed to Europe, I think that raises very high costs, very high risk in the Russian mind. But if you're sitting in the Kremlin now and you ask yourself, would Donald Trump send American forces to defend a NATO country? I think you're maybe thinking that answer is perhaps not. And to the extent that the Kremlin comes to believe that, their calculation of risks and costs changes in a way that makes Russian aggression more likely. And that worries me with Vladimir Putin because we've already seen, as in the case of his decision in February of 2022 to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin is capable of making huge miscalculations.
And I have to move into domestic politics now because we have midterm elections coming up, and the question will go to Robert. Robert, how will this issue play into elections, into campaigns? Do you expect change in rhetorics? How will parties stand on this topic? How do you see it coming?
Since 2004, elections in the United States have been base elections. And what I mean by that is fighting against lower voter turnout. Parties try to motivate their voters and get them to show up on election day. And that is a challenging thing. And so, unfortunately, in terms of the issue of Ukraine, it's not outside the diaspora, of which I am a part of, it is not necessarily a motivating factor during election time. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't important, but I think that the key issues in this election are going to be, first and foremost, the economy, which tend to decide elections most anywhere in any democracy or democratic republic, and that's an important factor here. And a lot of that is going to depend on what happens politically, not just politically, but in the global strategic order. the conflict in Iran, Venezuela, and other issues. So I think that is where the election is going to be decided. And there are a lot of people that have great predictions on the Republicans are going to lose everything or the Republicans might not. I will tell you one thing you can be certain of: the modern American elections, they're very, very difficult to predict. And I would tell you that we will have a better idea when we look at where the economy is in July, August, especially in August. And if the numbers are good, it will give the Republicans a fighting chance. If the numbers are bad, it's going to be a tough election year for my party.
With that, I want to segue to Ambassador Herbst. One issue driving economy now is, safe to say, oil prices, which is mostly defined by the situation in the Middle East now. How does United States action in Iran fit into America First policy? If America First was about less involvement abroad, aren't we more involved now with Iran?
There's no question that the administration's decision on Iran has proved controversial in Republican circles, albeit among a tiny slice, 5%, 10%. Loud voices like Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, but an overwhelming majority of Republicans and Trump Republicans, MAGA Republicans, support the action in Iran. But the loud voices do not, and there is some resonance to those voices. But Bob already talked about the political impact of that war on the administration's political strength in the United States. If in 3 months the war is still ongoing and oil prices are at that point probably a good bit higher than they are today, that's trouble for the administration in our midterm elections. So that will be more important than anything else. But there's one more point I can't not mention. I said in answer to your first question, there's a not very realist strain criticizing in the Republican Party, criticizing the support the United States provided to Ukraine, especially since the big invasion, but even before. Because they analogize that with our overly, let's say, our amateurish approach, whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq, or for that matter, Libya and Syria, in the Middle East. But there are some quote-unquote realists highly critical of America's intervention in Ukraine who are full bore in support of Trump's intervention in Iran. And I will deal with them at some point in the not-too-distant future.
We'll be counting on you. Deputy Minister, when you watch the news, when you watch international news, current events in the States, and you see contradicting statements, 10 Truth Social posts a day, what are the signals you're listening to, and what are the statements that have influence on the decision-making process in Kyiv, in Warsaw, in your country?
Yeah, I think that first of all, you look in the situation where you are and where the NATO are. And I think that the first thing, the threat. And Russia is an existential threat for the NATO, for Lithuania, and even the war in Ukraine is right now on the 5th year. So the Baltic region having the full pocket of the gray hybrid activities from the Russia by actively doing activities on the informational domain, propaganda, cyber, critical infrastructure, jamming the satellites, intercepting into the civil aviation. So first of all, you look where you are and what threats you are facing. Secondly, you look what actually was the big political purpose of the Putin. It was to broke the unity, to broke the cohesion. And I think that this is also, you have to take into consideration, how you perceive the messages or how you understand and how you should react. And lastly, I think that we should also take into account the dependencies or the gaps we have. And those gaps are very critical, which is not will be missed by the Russia. If we will talk that we will shift, we have a transit period, and Europe will develop those strategic capabilities or those dependencies what we have right now. And we understand that the United States is right now, is no secret, is providing those long-range and other very specific capabilities, which is NATO is right now required, the industry capacities, which is what the United States is having. So I think taking all into account, your decisions and your position and your decision-making has to be anyway balanced by understanding how much it is important for you and for the future.
So on any given day when you are watching international news and you see statements like Vice President saying he's proudest of cutting aid to US, or President saying NATO is an obsolete organization, do you say, oh, this is for domestic audience, this doesn't apply to us, or how do you filter those?
No, definitely. This is having the wave on the political level, how we are actually understanding and perceiving those messages. But from the my field, from the Minister of Defense, from the people who is working on the defense field and working with the NATO, working with the operational and the military side, so we see the situation, as I mentioned before, a little bit differently. We don't have any signals in the recent year that there is some changes which will affect, the presence of the United States in Lithuania. Since 2019, we have a permanent rotation of the 2 U.S. battalions. We have HIMARS training in our soil. We keep the United States readiness and providing the luxuries host nation support for them. Even B-52 is training on our training areas. So yeah, you can take into the consideration, but think what you say.
So this is how we are viewed in Lithuania, but how are our adversaries in Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, elsewhere interpreting America First? Laura.
Okay, well, first, I have to say we have to assume a fair amount of mirror imaging, and that for years and years and years, we've heard messaging, especially out of Moscow, but also Beijing, and especially to the global south, about the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy, about the U.S. as an imperialist nation that acts, according to international law only when it suits us. So this shift in policy emphasis, and really it's about the shift in actions as well, Venezuela, Iran, neither of which were with a coalition of allies. This has kind of played into our adversaries' sense that the United States is a superpower that seeks to maintain its status and seeks to intervene when it is useful to U.S. interests, but not as part of a collaborative coalition or rules-based framework. So I think they're interpreting it in a way that has some continuity with what they've perceived as U.S. policy, because certainly there have been many objections to U.S. interventions over the years. But they're adding this twist, and it really dovetails well with the last panel that discussed, the change in how international law is addressed in the current administration's policies.
Ambassador Taylor, talking to Financial Times today, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said, the biggest and most important question is if the United States is ready to be as loyal as it is described in NATO treaties. Is it?
I think we have to count on the United States being loyal to its commitments. I think that has to be the assumption. It's certainly my assumption that if challenged, NATO would respond and the United States would be there as well. I've heard people in the previous panel question that. And it's understandable, that kind of questioning. But for the reasons that Steve said, that Ambassador Pfeiffer talked about earlier, this is the basis of deterrence. And I think when push comes to shove, we will be there.
Thank you. In another news, President Zelensky arrived in Saudi Arabia today, and this is his second visit in less than a month. Ambassador Sestanovich, do you think Ukraine, in this case, is looking out for alternatives, for new allies elsewhere?
You know, if I could say something about the Ukrainian approach to dealing with Trump, I think this fits in very well with it. Because Zelensky and his colleagues have had a dual strategy for dealing with Trump. One is say thank you, thank you, thank you as often as possible. And the second thing is to say, now let's bargain. And now let's talk about the fine print of the minerals agreement, for example, or anything else you want to talk about. What Zelensky is doing in the Middle East is obviously finding other supporters, but he's also showing the president that, you know, I actually have some cards. You made a famous comment about how I had no cards, and you got a lot of coverage, and a lot of people laughed at me because you said that. But actually, what Zelensky is trying to do is show, I am not somebody who just says thank you, thank you, thank you. I am somebody you have to take seriously. And that, I think, has been a rather effective message. I'm not sure whether he's going to be able to cut any particular deals, but he's showing himself to be somebody who has cards, can advance his interests, and gets Trump's attention in that way.
Thank you. Ambassador Pfeiffer, according to Washington Post reporting today, United States is considering inviting Russia to J20 summit in December in Miami. Does this mean to you that Russia is back to the guest list to all the parties, like global parties, cool people parties?
Oh, that's, I guess in a way, not a surprise, given the way that President Trump has reached out to President Putin over the last 15 months. And remember, in Alaska when they met, that was the first time, I think, since 2022 when a major Western leader has met face-to-face with Putin. So in that sense, I don't think this is a surprise. Now, I'm not sure Mr. Putin will accept the invitation. And if he does, it's going to be very interesting seeing the reaction of the other attendees, which will include major European leaders who thus far have maintained the boycott on direct meetings with Mr. Putin.
Robert, I will cite one more article. In The Atlantic, a couple of days ago, there was an opinion piece by the professor from the St. Andrews University saying Ukraine has finally given up on Trump. Is it how you see it? Has Ukraine given up on Trump?
Well, I don't believe that's the case at all. I met with some incredible people the past several days, and during those meetings and those conversations, I'm leaving here more positive than when I arrived. And so I would find that impossible to believe, like many things I hear in the Western press. It's something that just is not indicative between the soldiers, the appointed officials, the elected officials that I've talked to the past couple of days. So, no, I don't believe that's true.
Are you referring to my article?
No, I would name you, no.
Because I had an
No, it was O'Brien's article.
Okay.
No. I would give you all the credit. I'm looking at the clock, which is like showing me red digits, so my job very often, every day, includes cutting stuff into shorter pieces at the TV station. So I want to apply this here now. Let's take 30 seconds, and this question goes to all of you. What's next, moving forward? Can America come back as a leader?
Well, here, I'll give you a motto that used to apply to something else that I think should apply to our policy moving forward, and it's build back better. When you look at Europe and the U.S. relationship with Europe, we need to build back. The better is actually the defense investment that we're seeing from Europe. I mean, that's the better. But also, Ukraine defense industry and the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces and what they are going to offer to international security. But we need to preserve these relationships and ties that have served us so well in the past.
Ambassador Herbst?
2 points. First, I believe that at the end of the day, it will be very difficult for Trump to do anything other but promote a peace which will enable Ukraine to survive securely. Point one. Point two, yes, we have shaken the foundations of NATO, and I say that with great sadness. But in the process, it's certainly true that some people in Team Trump recognize the importance of alliances to our own ability to project power. For example, the use of airspace and bases of our NATO allies.
Thank you. Deputy Minister?
So I would say that we need strong Europe and we need a strong United States. And we don't have to implement Putin's dream to break the cohesion and unity of NATO.
Robert?
I think a stronger Europe, a stronger Ukraine, and a more engaged United States is a good thing, and I think that's where we'll find ourselves.
Thank you. Ambassador Pfeiffer?
I hope the United States can come back. I think it's possible, but I think it's also going to take a lot of work. I think recent years have really undermined decades of trust and confidence that were established in the transatlantic relationship. And I'm also just mindful of one last thing. In 2021, a German diplomat told me at one point, this is like 2 or 3 months into the Biden administration, he said, you know, President Biden has done a lot that we think is good to restore transatlantic relations after the previous administration. He said, but how do we know the American electorate won't bring him or someone like that back? And I think it's important for Europeans to recognize that America is a democracy, and it's not just the views of the elites of the government, but it also is going to depend a lot on what the American people want.
Thank you. Ambassador Sestanovich? I understand you don't like the question, but...
I'm sorry to say that I think more damage to the Western alliance is probably ahead because it seems to be built into this administration. I think the next administration is likely to be interested in rejoining some kind of Western bloc. And the question will be what the state of that bloc is at that time, and incidentally, what European attitudes are toward having the United States back.
Thank you. And Ambassador Taylor.
The American people support our support to Ukraine. The American people also support a stronger position, a stance by the United States in the world. And I think that will allow us to earn back the support of the rest of the world, including here in Europe.
I have rarely seen panels so obedient to the rules and keeping it to time limits. Thank you very much. Thank you for the fascinating discussion. Thank you.